I give the name violence to a boldness lying idle and enamored of danger. It can be seen in a look, a walk, a smile, and it is in you that it creates an eddying. It unnerves you. This violence is a calm that disturbs you. One sometimes says, a guy with class. Pilorge's delicate features were of an extreme violence. Their delicacy in particular was violent. Violence of the design of Stilitano's only hand, simply lying on the table, still, rendering the repose disturbing and dangerous. I have worked with thieves and pimps, whose authority bent me to their will, but few proved to be really bold, whereas the one who was most so, Guy, was without violence. Stilitano, Pilorge, and Michaelis were cowards, Java too. Even when at rest, motionless and smiling, there escaped from them through the eyes, the nostrils, the mouth, the palm of the hand, the bulging basket, through that brutal hillock of the calf under the wool or denim, a radiant and somber anger, visible as a haze. But almost always there is nothing to indicate it, save the absence of the usual signs. René's face is charming at first. The downward curve of his nose gives him a roguish look, though the somewhat leaden paleness of his anxious face makes you uneasy. His eyes are hard, his movements calm and sure. In the cans, he calmly beats up the queers. He frisks them, robs them. Sometimes, as a finishing touch, he kicks them in the kisser with his heel. I don't like him, but his calmness masters me. He operates in the dead of night, around the urinals, the lawns, the shrubbery, under the trees on the Champs-Élysées, near the station, at the Porta Maillot, in the Bois de Boulogne, always at night, with a seriousness from which romanticism is excluded. When he comes in, at 2 or 3 in the morning, I feel him stocked with adventures. Every part of his body, which is nocturnal, has been involved. His hands, his arms, his legs, the back of his neck, but he, unaware of these marvels, tells me about them in forthright language. From his pockets he takes rings, wedding bands, watches, the evening's loot. He puts them in a big glass which will soon be full. He is not surprised by queers or their ways, which merely facilitate his jobs. When he sits on my bed, my ear snatches at scraps of adventure. An officer in underwear whose wallet, he says I did his wallet, he steals, and who, pointing with his forefinger, orders, "Get out!" René, the wise guy's answer, "You think you're in the army?" Too hard a punch on an old man's skull, the one who fainted when René, who was all excited, opened a drawer in which there was a supply of vials of morphine, the queer who was broke and whom he made get down on his knees before him. I am attentive to these accounts. My Antwerp life grows stronger, carrying on in a firmer body, in accordance with manly methods. I encourage René. I give him advice. He listens to me. I tell him never to talk first. Let the guy come up to you. Keep him dangling. Act a little surprised when he suggests that you do it. Figure out who to act dumb with. Every night I get a few scraps of information. My imagination does not get lost in them. My excitement seems to be due to my assuming within me the role of both victim and criminal. Indeed, as a matter of fact, I project at night the victim and criminal born of me. I bring them together somewhere, and toward morning I am thrilled to learn that the victim came very close to getting the death penalty and the criminal to being sent to the colony or guillotined. Thus my excitement extends as far as that region of myself which is Guyana. Without their wishing it, the gestures and destinies of these men are stormy. Their soul endures a violence which it had not desired and which it has domesticated. Those whose usual climate is violence are simple in relation to themselves. Each of the movements which make up this swift and devastating life is simple and straight, as clean as the stroke of a great draftsman. But when these strokes are encountered in movement, then the storm breaks, the lightning that kills them or me. Yet what is their violence compared to mine, which was to accept theirs, to make it mine, to wish it for myself, to intercept it, to utilize it, to force it upon myself, to know it, to premeditate it, to discern and assume its perils? But what was mine, willed and necessary for my defense, my toughness, my rigor, compared to the violence they underwent like a malediction, risen from an inner fire simultaneously with an outer light which sets them ablaze and illuminates us? We know that their adventures are childish. They themselves are fools. They are ready to kill or be killed over a card game in which an opponent, or they themselves, was cheating. Yet thanks to such guys, tragedies are possible. This kind of definition by so many opposing examples of violence shows you that I shall not make use of words the better to depict an event or its hero, but so that they may tell you something about myself. In order to understand me, the reader's complicity will be necessary. Nevertheless, I shall warn him whenever my lyricism makes me lose my footing. Stilitano was big and strong. His gait was both supple and heavy, brisk and slow, sinuous. He was nimble. A large part of his power over me and over the whores of the Barrio Chino lay in the spittle he passed from one cheek to the other, and which he would sometimes draw out in front of his mouth like a veil. But where does he get that spit? I would ask myself. Where does he bring it up from? Mine will never have the unctuousness or color of his. It will merely be spun glassware, transparent and fragile. It was therefore natural for me to imagine what his penis would be if he smeared it for my benefit with so fine a substance, with that precious cobweb, a tissue which I secretly called the veil of the palace. He wore an old grey cap with a broken visor. When he tossed it on the floor of our room, it suddenly became the carcass of a poor partridge with a clipped wing. But when he put it on, pulling it down a bit over the ear, the opposite edge of the visor rose up to reveal the most glorious of blonde locks. Shall I speak of his lovely bright eyes, modestly lowered? Yet it could be said of Stilitano, his bearing is immodest, over which there closed eyelids and lashes so blonde, so luminous and thick, that they brought in not the shade of evening, but the shade of evil. After all, what meaning would there be in the sight that staggers me when, in a harbor, I see a sail, little, by fits and starts, spreading out and with difficulty rising on the mast of a ship, hesitantly at first, then resolutely, if these movements were not the very symbol of the movements of my love for Stilitano? I met him in Barcelona. He was living among beggars, thieves, fairies, and whores. He was handsome, but it remains to be seen whether he owed all that beauty to my fallen state. My clothes were dirty and shabby. I was hungry and cold. This was the most miserable period of my life. 1932. Spain at the time was covered with vermin, its beggars. They went from village to village, to Andalusia because it is warm, to Catalonia because it is rich, but the whole country was favorable to us. I was thus a louse, and conscious of being one. In Barcelona we hung around the Calle Mediodía and the Calle Carmen. We sometimes slept 6 in a bed without sheets, and at dawn we would go begging in the markets. We would leave the Barrio Chino in a group and scatter over to the Paraielo. Carrying shopping baskets for the housewives would give us a leek or a turnip rather than a coin. At noon we would return, and with the gleanings we would make our soup. It is the life of vermin that I am going to describe. In Barcelona I saw male couples in which the more loving of the two would say to the other, "I'll take the basket this morning." He would take it and leave. One day Salvador gently pulled the basket from my hands and said, "I'm going to beg for you." It was snowing. He went out in the freezing street wearing a torn and tattered jacket. The pockets were ripped and hung down, and a shirt stiff with dirt. His face was poor and unhappy, shifty, pale, and filthy, for we dared not wash since it was so cold. Around noon, he returned with the vegetables and a bit of fat. Here I draw attention to one of those lacerations, horrible, for I shall provoke them despite the danger, by which beauty was revealed to me. An immense and brotherly love swelled my body and bore me toward Salvador. Leaving the hotel shortly after him, I would see him, away off, beseeching the women. I knew the formula, as I had already begged for others and myself. It mixes Christian religion with charity. It merges the poor person with God. It is so humble an emanation from the heart that I think it scents with violet the straight light breath of the beggar who utters it. All over Spain at the time they were saying, "Por Dios." Without hearing him, I would imagine Salvador murmuring it at all the stalls, to all the housewives. I would keep an eye on him as the pimp keeps an eye on his whore, but with such tenderness in my heart. Thus Spain in my life as a beggar familiarized me with the stateliness of abjection, for it took a great deal of pride, that is, of love, to embellish those filthy, despised creatures. It took a great deal of talent, which came to me little by little. Though I may be unable to describe its mechanism to you, at least I can say that I slowly forced myself to consider that wretched life as a deliberate necessity. Never did I try to make of it something other than what it was. I did not try to adorn it, to mask it, but, on the contrary, I wanted to affirm it in its exact sordidness, and the most sordid signs became for me signs of grandeur. I was dismayed when, one evening, while searching me after a raid, I'm speaking of a scene which preceded the one with which this book begins, the astonished detective took from my pocket, among other things, a tube of Vaseline. We dared joke about it, since it contained mentholated Vaseline. The whole record office, and I too, though painfully, writhed with laughter at the following. You take it in the nose? Watch out you don't catch cold, you'd give your guy whooping cough. I translate, but lamely, in the language of a Paris hustler, the malicious irony of the vivid and venomous Spanish phrases. It concerned a tube of Vaseline, one of whose ends was partially rolled up, which amounts to saying that it had been put to use. Amidst the elegant objects taken from the pockets of the men who had been picked up in the raid, it was the very sign of abjection, of that which is concealed with the greatest of care, but yet the sign of a secret grace which was soon to save me from contempt. When I was locked up in a cell, and as soon as I had sufficiently regained my spirits to rise above the misfortune of my arrest, the image of the tube of Vaseline never left me. The policemen had shown it to me victoriously, since they could thereby flourish their revenge, their hatred, their contempt. But lo and behold, that dirty, wretched object whose purpose seemed to the world, to that concentrated delegation of the world which is the police, and, above all, that particular gathering of Spanish police, smelling of garlic, sweat, and oil, but substantial-looking, stout of muscle, and strong in their moral assurance, utterly vile, became extremely precious to me. Unlike many objects which my tenderness singles out, this one was not at all haloed. It remained on the table a little grey leaden tube of Vaseline, broken and livid, whose astonishing discreetness, and its essential correspondence with all the commonplace things in the record office of a prison, the bench, the inkwell, the regulations, the scales, the odor, would, through the general indifference, have distressed me, had not the very content of the tube made me think, by bringing to mind an oil lamp, perhaps because of its unctuous character, of a nightlight beside a coffin. In describing it, I recreate the little object. But the following image cuts in. Beneath a lamp-post, in a street of a city where I am writing, the pallid face of a little old woman, a round, flat little face, like the moon, very pale. I cannot tell whether it was sad or hypocritical. She approached me, told me she was very poor, and asked for a little money. The gentleness of that moonfish face told me at once the old woman had just got out of prison. She's a thief, I said to myself. As I walked away from her, a kind of intense reverie, living deep within me, and not the edge of my mind, led me to think that it was perhaps my mother whom I had just met. I know nothing of her who abandoned me in the cradle, but I hoped it was that old thief who begged at night. What if it were she, I thought, as I walked away from the old woman. Oh, if it were! I would cover her with flowers, with gladioluses and roses, and with kisses. I would weep with tenderness over those moonfish eyes, over that round, foolish face. And why, I went on, why weep over it? It did not take my mind long to replace these customary marks of tenderness by some other gesture, even the vilest and most contemptible, which I empowered to mean as much as the kisses, or the tears, or the flowers. I'd be glad to slobber over her, I thought, overflowing with love. Does the word gladiolus, mentioned above, bring into play the word glavio, gobs of spit? To slobber over her hair, or vomit into her hands. But I would adore that thief who is my mother. The tube of Vaseline, which was intended to grease my prick and those of my lovers, summoned up the face of her who, during a reverie that moved through the dark alleys of the city, was the most cherished of mothers. It had served me in the preparation of so many secret joys, in places worthy of its discreet banality, that it had become the condition of my happiness, as my sperm-spotted handkerchief testified. Lying on the table, it was a banner telling the invisible legions of my triumph over the police. I was in a cell. I knew that all night long my tube of Vaseline would be exposed to the scorn, the contrary of a perpetual adoration, of a group of strong, handsome, husky policemen. So strong that if the weakest of them barely squeezed his fingers together, there would shoot forth, first with a slight fart, brief and dirty, a ribbon of gum which would continue to emerge in a ridiculous silence. Nevertheless, I was sure that this puny and most humble object would hold its own against them. By its mere presence it would be able to exasperate all the police in the world. It would draw down upon itself contempt, hatred, white and dumb rages. It would perhaps be slightly bantering, like a tragic hero amused at stirring up the wrath of the gods, indestructible, like him, faithful to my happiness, and proud. I would like to hymn it with the newest words in the French language, but I would have also liked to fight for it, to organize massacres in its honor and bedeck a countryside at twilight with red bunting. Footnote. I would indeed rather have shed blood than repudiate that silly object. End footnote. The beauty of a moral act depends on the beauty of its expression. To say that it is beautiful is to decide that it will be so. It remains to be proven so. This is the task of images, that is, of the correspondences with the splendors of the physical world. The act is beautiful if it provokes, and in our throat reveals, song. Sometimes the consciousness with which we have pondered a reputedly vile act, the power of expression which must signify it, impel us to song. This means that treachery is beautiful if it makes us sing. To betray thieves would be not only to find myself again in the moral world, I thought, but also to find myself once more in homosexuality. As I grow strong, I am my own god. I dictate. Applied to men, the word beauty indicates to me the harmonious quality of a face and body, to which is sometimes added manly grace. Beauty is then accompanied by magnificent, masterly, sovereign gestures. We imagine that they are determined by very special moral attitudes, and by the cultivation of such virtues in ourselves, we hope to endow our poor faces and sick bodies with the vigor that our lovers possess naturally. Alas, these virtues, which they themselves never possess, are our weakness. Now, as I write, I muse on my lovers. I would like them to be smeared with my Vaseline, with that soft, slightly mentholated substance. I would like their muscles to bathe in that delicate transparence without which the tool of the handsomest is less lovely. When a limb has been removed, the remaining one is said to grow stronger. I had hoped that the vigor of the arm which Stilitano had lost might be concentrated in his penis. For a long time I imagined a solid member, like a blackjack, capable of the most outrageous impudence, though what first intrigued me was what Stilitano allowed me to know of it. The mere crease, though curiously precise in the left leg, of his blue denim trousers. This detail might have haunted my dreams less had Stilitano not, at odd moments, put his left hand on it, and had he not, like ladies making a curtsy, indicated the crease by delicately pinching the cloth with his nails. I do not think he ever lost his self-possession, but with me he was particularly calm. With a slightly impertinent smile, though quite nonchalantly, he would watch me adore him. I know that he will love me. Before Salvador, basket in hand, crossed the threshold of our hotel, I was so excited that I kissed him in the street, but he pushed me aside. "You're crazy. People take us for mariconas." He spoke French fairly well, having learned it in the region around Perpignan where he used to go for the grape harvesting. Deeply wounded, I turned away. His face was purple. His complexion was that of winter cabbage. Salvador did not smile. He was shocked. "That's what I get," he must have thought, "for getting up so early to go begging in the snow. He doesn't know how to behave." His hair was wet and shaggy. Behind the window, faces were staring at us, for the lower part of the hotel was occupied by a cafe that opened on the street and through which you had to pass in order to go up to the rooms. Salvador wiped his face with his sleeve and went in. I hesitated, then I followed. I was 20 years old. If the drop that hesitates at the edge of a nostril has the limpidity of a tear, why shouldn't I drink it with the same eagerness? I was already sufficiently involved in the rehabilitation of the ignoble. Were it not for the fear of revolting Salvador, I would have done it in the cafe. He, however, sniffled, and I gathered that he was swallowing his snot. Basket in arm, passing the beggars and the gutter snipes, he moved toward the kitchen. He preceded me. "What's the matter with you?" I said. "You're attracting attention." "What's wrong?" "People don't kiss that way on the sidewalk. Tonight, if you like." He said it all with a charmless pout, and the same disdain. I had simply wanted to show my gratitude, to warm him with my poor tenderness. "But what were you thinking?" Someone bumped into him without apologizing, separating him from me. I did not follow him to the kitchen. I went over to the bench where there was a vacant seat near the stove. Though I adored vigorous beauty, I didn't bother my head much about how I would bring myself to love this homely, squalid beggar who was bullied by the less bold, how I could come to care for this angular buttocks, and what if, unfortunately, he were to have a magnificent tool. The Barrio Chino was, at the time, a kind of haunt thronged less with Spaniards than with foreigners, all of them down-and-out bums. We were sometimes dressed in almond green or jonquil yellow silk shirts and shabby sneakers, and our hair was so plastered down that it looked as if it would crack. We did not have leaders, but rather directors. I am unable to explain how they became what they were. Probably it was as a result of profitable operations in the sale of our meager booty. They attended to our affairs and let us know about jobs for which they took a reasonable commission. We did not form loosely organized bands, but amidst that vast, filthy disorder, in a neighborhood stinking of oil, piss, and shit, a few waifs and strays relied on others more clever than themselves. The squalor sparkled with the youth of many of our number, and with the more mysterious brilliance of a few who had really scintillated, youngsters whose bodies, gazes, and gestures were charged with a magnetism which made of us their object. That is how I was staggered by one of them. In order to do justice to the one-armed Stilitano, I shall wait a few pages. Let it be known from the start that he was devoid of any Christian virtue. All his brilliance, all his power, had their source between his legs. His penis, and that which completes it, the whole apparatus, was so beautiful that the only thing I can call it is a generative organ. One might have thought he was dead, for he rarely and slowly got excited. He watched. He generated in the darkness of a well-buttoned fly. Though buttoned by only one hand, the luminosity with which its bearer will be aglow. My relations with Salvador lasted for 6 months. It was not the most intoxicating, but rather the most fecund of loves. I had managed to love that sickly body, gray face, and ridiculously sparse beard. Salvador took care of me, but at night, by candlelight, I hunted for lice, our pets, in the seams of his trousers. The lice inhabited us. They imparted to our clothes an animation, a presence which, when they had gone, left our garments lifeless. We liked to know and feel that the translucent bugs were swarming. Though not tamed, they were so much a part of us that a third person's louse disgusted us. We chased them away, but with the hope that during the day the nits would have hatched. We crushed them with our nails, without disgust and without hatred. We did not throw their corpses, or remains, into the garbage. We let them fall, bleeding with our blood, into our untidy underclothes. The lice were the only sign of our prosperity, of the very underside of prosperity. But it was logical that by making our state perform an operation which justified it, we were, by the same token, justifying the sign of this state. Having become as useful for the knowledge of our decline as jewels for the knowledge of what is called triumph, the lice were precious. They were both our shame and our glory. I lived for a long time in a room without windows, except a transom on the corridor, where in the evening 5 little faces, cruel and tender, smiling or screwed up with the cramp of a difficult position, dripping with sweat, would hunt for those insects of whose virtue we partook. It was good that, in the depths of such wretchedness, I was the lover of the poorest and homeliest. I thereby had a rare privilege. I had difficulty, but every victory I achieved, my filthy hands, proudly exposed, helped me proudly expose my beard and long hair, gave me strength, or weakness, and here it amounts to the same thing, for the following victory, which in your language would naturally be called a come-down. Yet light and brilliance being necessary to our lives, a sunbeam did cross the pane and its filth, and penetrate the dimness. We had the hoarfrost, the silver thaw, for these elements, though they may spell calamity, evoke joys whose sign, detached in our room, was adequate for us. All we knew of Christmas and New Year's festivities was what always accompanies them and what makes them dearer to merrymakers: frost. The cultivation of sores by beggars is also their means of getting a little money on which to live. But though they may be led to this out of a certain inertia in their state of poverty, the pride required for holding one's head up above contempt is a manly virtue. Like a rock in a river, pride breaks through and divides contempt, bursts it. Entering further into abjection, pride will be stronger, if the beggar is myself, when I have the knowledge, strength or weakness, to take advantage of such a fate. It is essential, as this leprosy gains on me, that I gain on it, and that, in the end, I win out. Shall I therefore become increasingly vile, more and more an object of disgust, up to that final point, which is something still unknown, but which must be governed by an aesthetic as well as moral inquiry? It is said that leprosy, to which I compare our state, causes an irritation of the tissues. The sick person scratches himself, he gets an erection, masturbation becomes frequent. In his solitary eroticism, the leper consoles himself and hymns his disease. Poverty made us erect. All across Spain we carried a secret, veiled magnificence unmixed with arrogance. Our gestures grew humbler and humbler, fainter and fainter, as the embers of humility which kept us alive glowed more intensely. Thus developed my talent for giving a sublime meaning to so beggarly an appearance. I am not yet speaking of literary talent. It proved to have been a very useful discipline for me, and still enables me to smile tenderly at the humblest among the dregs, whether human or material, including vomit, including the saliva I let drool on my mother's face, including your excrement. I shall preserve within me the idea of myself as beggar. I wanted to be like that woman who, at home, hidden away from people, sheltered her daughter, a kind of hideous, misshapen monster, stupid and white, who grunted and walked on all fours. When the monster gave birth, her despair was probably such that it became the very essence of her life. She decided to love this monster, to love the ugliness that had come out of her belly in which it had been elaborated, and to erect it devotedly. Within herself she ordained an altar where she preserved the idea of monster. With devoted care, with hands gentle despite the callouses of her daily toil, with the willful zeal of the hopeless, she set herself up against the world, and against the world she set up the monster, which took on the proportions of the world and its power. It was on the basis of the monster that new principles were ordained, principles constantly combated by the forces of the world, which came charging into her, but which stopped at the walls of her dwelling where her daughter was confined. Footnote. I learned from the newspapers that, after 40 years of devotion, this mother sprayed her sleeping daughter, and then the whole house, with gasoline, or petroleum, and set fire to the house. The monster, the daughter, died. The old woman, aged 75, was rescued from the flames and was saved. That is, she was brought to trial. End footnote. But, for it was sometimes necessary to steal, we also knew the clear earthly beauties of boldness. Before we went to sleep, the chief, the liege lord, would give us advice. For example, we would go with fake papers to various consulates in order to be repatriated. The consul, moved or annoyed by our woes and wretchedness and our filth, would give us a train ticket to a border post. Our chief would resell it at the Barcelona station. He also let us know of thefts to commit in churches, which Spaniards would not dare do, or in elegant villas. And it was he himself who brought us the Dutch and English sailors, to whom we had to prostitute ourselves for a few pesetas. Thus we sometimes stole, and each burglary allowed us to breathe for a moment at the surface. A vigil of arms precedes each nocturnal expedition. The nervousness provoked by fear, and sometimes by anxiety, makes for a state akin to religious moods. At such times I tend to see omens in the slightest accidents. Things become signs of chance. I want to charm the unknown powers upon which the success of the adventure seems to me to depend. I try to charm them by moral acts, chiefly by charity. I give more readily and more freely to beggars. I give my seat to old people. I stand aside to let them pass. I help blind men cross the street, and so on. In this way, I seem to recognize that over the act of stealing rules a God to whom moral actions are agreeable. These attempts to throw out a net on the chance that this God, of whom I know nothing, will be caught in it, exhaust me, disturb me, and also favor the religious state. To the act of stealing they communicate the gravity of a ritual act. It will really be performed in the heart of darkness, to which is added that it may be rather at night, while people are asleep, in a place that is closed and perhaps itself masked in black. The walking on tiptoe, the silence, the invisibility which we need even in broad daylight, the groping hands organizing in the darkness gestures of an unwanted complexity and wariness. Merely to turn a doorknob requires a host of movements, each as brilliant as the facet of a jewel. When I discover gold, it seems to me that I have unearthed it. I have ransacked continents, South Sea islands. I am surrounded by Negroes. They threaten my defenseless body with their poisoned spears. But then the virtue of the gold acts, and a great vigor crushes or exalts me. The spears are lowered, the Negroes recognize me, and I am one of the tribe. The perfect act, inadvertently putting my hand into the pocket of a handsome sleeping Negro, feeling its prick stiffen beneath my fingers, and withdrawing my hand closed over a gold coin discovered in and stolen from his pocket. The prudence, the whispering voice, the alert ear, the invisible nervous presence of the accomplice, and the understanding of his slightest sign, all concentrate our being within us, compress us, make of us a very ball of presence, which so well explains Guy's remark, "You feel yourself living." But within myself, this total presence, which is transformed into a bomb of what seems to me terrific power, imparts to the act a gravity, a terminal oneness. The burglary, while being performed, is always the last.
Not that you think you are not going to perform another after that one. You don't think. But because such a gathering of self cannot take place, not in life, for to push it further would be to pass out of life. And this oneness of an act which develops as the rose puts forth its corolla into conscious gestures, sure of their efficacy, of their fragility, and yet of the violence which they give to the act, here too confers upon it the value of a religious rite. Often I even dedicate it to someone. The first time it was Stilitano, who had the benefit of such homage. I think it was by him that I was initiated. That is, my obsession with his body kept me from flinching. To his beauty, to his tranquil immodesty, I dedicated my first thefts. To the singularity, too, of that splendid cripple whose hand, cut off at the wrist, was rotting away somewhere, under a chestnut tree, so he told me, in a forest of Central Europe. During the theft, my body is exposed. I know what it is sparkling with. I know that it is sparkling with all my gestures. The world is attentive to all my movements, if it wants me to trip up. I shall pay dearly for a mistake, but if there is a mistake and I catch it in time, it seems to me that there will be joy in our Father's dwelling. Or I fall, and there is woe upon woe and then prison. But as for the savages, the convict who risked the getaway will then meet them by means of the procedure briefly described above in my inner adventure. If, going through the virgin forest, he comes upon a placer guarded by ancient tribes, he will either be killed by them or be saved. It is by a long, long road that I choose to go back to primitive life. What I need first is condemnation by my race. Salvador was not a source of pride to me. When he did steal, he merely filched trifles from stands in front of shop windows. At night, in the cafes where we huddled together, he would sadly worm himself in among the most handsome. That kind of life exhausted him. When I entered, I would be ashamed to find him hunched over, squatting on a bench, his shoulders huddled up in the green and yellow cotton blanket with which he would go out begging on wintry days. He would also be wearing an old black woolen shawl, which I refused to put on. Indeed, though my mind endured, even desired humility, my violent young body rejected it. Salvador would speak in a sad, reticent voice. "Would you like us to go back to France? We'll work in the country." I said no. He did not understand my loathing, no, my hatred of France, nor that my adventure, if it stopped in Barcelona, was bound to continue deeply, more and more deeply, in the remotest regions of myself. "But I'll do all the work. You'll take it easy." No. I would leave him on his bench to his cheerless poverty. I would go over to the stove or the bar and smoke the butts I had gleaned during the day with a scornful young Andalusian whose dirty white woolen sweater exaggerated his torso and muscles. After rubbing his hands together, the way old men do, Salvador would leave his bench and go to the community kitchen to prepare a soup and put a fish on the grill. Once he suggested that we go down to Huelva for the orange picking. It was an evening when he had received so many humiliations, so many rebuffs while begging for me, that he dared reproach me for my poor success at the Criolla. "Really, when you pick up a client, it's you who ought to pay him." We quarreled in front of the proprietor of the hotel, who wanted to put us out. Salvador and I, therefore, decided to steal 2 blankets the following day and hide in a southbound freight train. But I was so clever that very evening I brought back the cape of a customs officer. As I passed the docks where they mount guard, one of the officers called me. I did what he required in the sentry box. After coming, perhaps without daring to tell me so, he wanted to wash at a little fountain. He left me alone for a moment, and I ran off with his big black woolen cape. I wrapped myself up in it in order to return to the hotel, and I knew the happiness of the equivocal, not yet the joy of betrayal, though the insidious confusion which would make me deny fundamental oppositions was already forming. As I opened the door of the cafe, I saw Salvador. He was the saddest looking of the beggars. His face had the quality and almost the texture of the sawdust that covered the floor of the cafe. Immediately I recognized Stilitano standing in the midst of the ronda players. Our eyes met. His gaze lingered on me, who blushed. I took off the black cape, and at once they started haggling over it. Without yet taking part, Stilitano watched the wretched bargaining. "Make it snappy if you want it," I said. "Make up your minds. The customs man is sure to come looking for me." The players got a little more active. They were used to such reasons. When the general shuffle brought me to his side, Stilitano said to me in French, "You from Paris?" "Yes. Why?" "For no reason." Although it was he who had made the first advance, I knew, as I answered, the almost desperate nature of the gesture the invert dares when he approaches a young man. To mask my confusion, I had the pretext of being breathless. I had the bustle of the moment. He said, "You did pretty well for yourself." I knew that this praise was cleverly calculated, but how handsome Stilitano was amidst the beggars. I didn't know his name yet. One of his arms
at the extremity of which was an enormous bandage, was folded on his chest as if in a sling, but I knew that the hand was missing. Stilitano was an habitué of neither the cafe nor even the street. "What'll the cape cost me?" "Will you pay me for it?" "Why not?" "With what?" "Are you scared?" "Where are you from?" "Serbia. I'm back from the Foreign Legion. I'm a deserter." I was relieved, destroyed. The emotion created within me a void which was at once filled by the memory of a nuptial scene. In a dance hall where soldiers were dancing among themselves, I watched their waltz. It seemed to me at the time that the invisibility of two legionnaires became total. They were charmed away by emotion. Though their dance was chaste at the beginning of Ramona, would it remain so when, in our presence, they wedded by exchanging a smile as lovers exchange rings? To all the injunctions of an invisible clergy the Legion answered, "I do." Each one of them was the couple wearing both a net veil and a dress uniform, white leather, scarlet, and green shoulder braid. They haltingly exchanged their manly tenderness and wifely modesty. To maintain the emotion at a high pitch, they slowed up and slackened their dance, while their pricks, numbed by the fatigue of a long march, recklessly threatened and challenged each other behind a barricade of rough denim. The patent leather visors of their kepis kept striking together. I knew I was being mastered by Stilitano. I wanted to play sly. "That doesn't prove you can pay." "Trust me." Such a hard-looking face, such a strapping body were asking me to trust them. Salvador was watching us. He was aware of our understanding and realized that we had already decided upon his ruin, his loneliness. Fierce and pure, I was the theater of a fairyland restored to life. When the waltz ended, the two soldiers disengaged themselves, and each of the two halves of a solemn and dizzy block hesitated, and, happy to be escaping from invisibility, went off, downcast, toward some girl for the next waltz. "I'll give you 2 days to pay me," I said. "I need dough. I was in the Legion too, and I deserted, like you." "You'll get it." I handed him the cape. He took it with his only hand and gave it back to me. He smiled, though imperiously, and said, "Roll it up," and joshingly added, while waiting to roll me one. Everyone knows the expression "to roll a skate." Footnote. To roll a skate is French slang meaning to kiss with the tongue, end footnote. Without batting an eyelash, I did as he said. The cape immediately disappeared into one of the hotel proprietor's hiding places. Perhaps this simple theft brightened my face. Or Stilitano simply wanted to act nice. He added, "You going to treat an ex-Bel-Abbé boy to a drink?" A glass of wine cost 2 sous. I had 4 in my pocket, but I owed them to Salvador, who was watching us. "I'm broke," Stilitano said proudly. The card players were forming new groups, which for a moment separated us from Salvador. I muttered between my teeth, "I've got 4 sous, and I'm going to slip them to you, but you're the one who'll pay." Stilitano smiled. I was lost. We sat down at a table. He had already begun to talk about the Legion when, staring hard at me, he suddenly broke off. "I've got a feeling I've seen you somewhere before." As for me, I had retained the memory. I had to grab hold of invisible tackle. I could have cooed. Words, or the tone of my voice, would have not merely expressed my ardor. I would not have merely sung. My throat would have uttered the call of indeed the most amorous of wild game. Perhaps my neck would have bristled with white feathers. A catastrophe is always possible. Metamorphosis lies in wait for us. Panic protected me. I have lived in the fear of metamorphoses. It is in order to make the reader fully conscious as he sees love swooping down on me. It is not mere rhetoric which requires the comparison. Like a falcon, of the most exquisite of frights, that I employ the idea of a turtle dove. I do not know what I felt at the moment, but today all I need do is summon up the vision of Stilitano for my distress to appear at once in the relationship of a cruel bird to its victim. Were it not that I felt my neck swell out with a gentle cooing, I would have spoken rather of a robin redbreast. A curious creature would appear if each of my emotions became the animal it evokes. Anger rumbles within my cobra neck. The same cobra swells up my prick. My steeds and merry-go-rounds are born of my insolence. Of a turtle-dove I retained only a hoarseness, which Stilitano noticed. I coughed. Behind the Pariello was an empty lot where the hoodlums played cards. The Pariello is an avenue in Barcelona parallel to the famous Ramblas. Between these two wide thoroughfares, a multitude of dark, dirty, narrow streets make up the Barrio Chino. Squatting on the ground, they would organize games. They would lay out the cards on a square piece of cloth or in the dust. A young gypsy was running one of the games, and I came to risk the few sous I had in my pocket. I am not a gambler. Rich casinos do not attract me.
The atmosphere of electric chandeliers bores me. The affected casualness of the elegant gambler nauseates me. And the impossibility of acting upon the balls, roulettes, and little horses discourages me. But I loved the dust, filth, and haste of the hoodlums. When I bugger, ... footnote, since the hero, whom at first I called by his real name, is my current lover, 1948, prudence advises me to leave a blank in place of his name. End footnote. As I bend farther forward, I get a profile view of his face crushed against the pillow, of his pain. I see the wincing of his features, but also their radiant anguish. I often watched this on the grimy faces of the squatting urchins. This whole population was keyed up for winning or losing. Every thigh was quivering with fatigue or anxiety. The weather that day was threatening. I was caught up in the youthful impatience of the young Spaniards. I played and I won. I won every hand. I didn't say a word during the game. Besides, the gypsy was a stranger to me. Custom permitted me to pocket my money and leave. The boy was so good-looking that by leaving him in that way I felt I was lacking in respect for the beauty, suddenly become sad, of his face, which was drooping with heat and boredom. I kindly gave him back his money. Slightly astonished, he took it and simply thanked me. "Hello, Pepe," a kinky, swarthy-looking cripple called out as he limped by. "Pepe," I said to myself, "his name is Pepe," and I left, for I had just noticed his delicate, almost feminine little hand. But hardly had I gone a few steps in that crowd of thieves, whores, beggars, and queers, than I felt someone touching me on the shoulder. It was Pepe. He had just left the game. He spoke to me in Spanish. "My name is Pepe." "Mine is Juan. Come, let's have a drink." He was no taller than I. His face, which I had seen from above when he was squatting, looked less flattened. The features were finer. He's a girl, I thought, summoning up the image of his slender hand, and I felt that his company would bore me. He had just decided that we would drink the money I had won. We made the round of the bars, and all the while we were together he was quite charming. He wore a very low-necked blue jersey instead of a shirt. From the opening emerged a solid neck as broad as his head. When he turned it without moving his chest, an enormous tendon stood out. I tried to imagine his body, and despite the almost frail hands, I imagined it to be solid, for his thighs filled out the light cloth of his trousers. The weather was warm. The storm did not break. The nervousness of the players around us heightened. The whores seemed heavier. The dust and sun were oppressive. We drank hardly any liquor, but rather lemonade. We sat near the peddlers and exchanged an occasional word. He kept smiling, with a slight weariness. He seemed to be indulging me. Did he suspect that I liked his cute face? I don't know, but he didn't let on. Besides, I had the same sly sort of look as he. I seemed a threat to the well-dressed passer-by. I had his youth and his filth, and I was French. Toward evening he wanted to gamble, but it was too late to start a game as all the places were taken. We strolled about a bit among the players. When he brushed by the whores, Pepe would kid them. Sometimes he would pinch them. The heat grew more oppressive. The sky was flush with the ground. The nervousness of the crowd became irritating. Impatience prevailed over the gypsy, who had not decided which game to join. He was fingering the money in his pocket. Suddenly he took me by the arm. "Venga!" He led me a few steps away to the one comfort station on the Pariello. It was run by an old woman. Surprised by the suddenness of his decision, I questioned him. "What are you going to do?" "Wait for me." "Why?" He answered with a Spanish word which I did not understand. I told him so, and, in front of the old woman who was waiting for her 2 sous, he burst out laughing and made the gesture of jerking off. When he came out, his face had a bit of color. He was still smiling. "It's all right now. I'm ready." That was how I learned that, on big occasions, players went there to jerk off in order to be calmer and more sure of themselves. We went back to the lot. Pepe chose a group. He lost. He lost all he had. I tried to restrain him. It was too late. As authorized by custom, he asked the man running the bank to give him a stake from the kitty for the next game. The man refused. It seemed to me that the very thing that constituted the gypsy's gentleness turned sour as milk turns, and became the most ferocious rage I have ever seen. He whisked away the bank. The man bounded up and tried to kick him. Pepe dodged. He handed me the money, but hardly had I pocketed it than his knife was open. He planted it in the heart of the Spaniard, a tall, bronzed fellow, who fell to the ground and who, despite his tan, turned pale, contracted, writhed, and expired in the dust. For the first time I saw someone give up the ghost. Pepe had disappeared, but when, turning my eyes away from the corpse, I looked up, there, gazing at it with a faint smile, was still Atano. The sun was about to set. The dead man and the handsomest of humans seemed to me merged in the same golden dust amidst a throng of sailors, soldiers, hoodlums, and thieves from all parts of the world. The earth did not revolve. Carrying Stilitano, it trembled about the sun. At the same moment, I came to know death and love. This vision, however, was very brief, for I could not stay there because I was afraid I might have been spotted with Pepe, and lest a friend of the dead man snatch away the money which I kept in my pocket. But as I moved off, my memory kept alive and commented upon the following scene, which seemed to me grandiose. The murder by a charming child of a grown man whose tan could turn pale, take on the hue of death, the whole ironically observed by a tall, blonde youngster to whom I had just become secretly engaged. Rapid as my glance at him was, I had time to take in Stilitano's superb muscularity, and to see, between his lips, rolling in his half-open mouth, a white, heavy blob of spit, thick as a white worm, which he shifted about, stretching it from top to bottom, until it veiled his mouth. He stood barefoot in the dust. His legs were contained in a pair of worn and shabby faded blue denim trousers. The sleeves of his green shirt were rolled up, one of them above an amputated hand. The wrist, where the resewn skin still revealed a pale pink scar, was slightly shrunken. Beneath a tragic sky, I was to cross the loveliest landscapes in the world when Stilitano took my hand at night. What was the nature of that fluid which passed with a shock from him to me? I walked along dangerous shores, emerged into dismal plains, heard the sea. Hardly had I touched him when the stairway changed. He was master of the world. With the memory of those brief moments, I could describe to you walks, breathless flights, pursuits in countries of the world where I shall never go. Stilitano smiled and laughed at me. "Are you stringing me along?" "A little," he said. "Go right ahead." He smiled again and raised his eyebrows. "Why?" "You know that you're a good-looking kid, and you think you don't have to give a damn about anyone." "I've got a right to. I'm a nice guy." "You're sure?" He burst out laughing. "Sure, no mistake. I'm so likable that sometimes I can't get rid of people. In order to shake them off, I sometimes have to do them dirt." "What kind of dirt?" "You want to know? Just wait. You'll see me on the job. You'll have time to see what it's like." "Where are you staying?" "Here." "Don't. The police will be around. They'll look here first. Come with me." I told Salvador that I couldn't stay at the hotel that night, and that a former member of the Legion was offering me his room. He turned pale. The humility of his pain made me feel ashamed. In order to leave him without remorse, I insulted him. I was able to, since he loved me to the point of devotion. He gave me a woebegone look, but it was charged with a poor wretch's hatred. I replied with the word fruit. I joined Stilitano, who was waiting for me outside. His hotel was in the darkest alley in the neighborhood. He had been living there for some days. A stairway from the corridor, which opened out to the sidewalk, led to the rooms. As we were going up, he said to me, "Do you want us to shack up together?" "If you feel like it." "You're right. We'll stay out of trouble easier." In front of the door of the corridor, he said to me, "Hand me the box." We had only one box of matches between us. "It's empty," I said. He swore. Stilitano took me by the hand, putting his own behind his back, for I was at his right. "Follow me," he said, "and stop talking. The staircase has ears." Gently he led me from step to step. I no longer knew where we were going. A wondrously supple athlete was leading me about in the night. A more ancient and more Greek Antigone was making me scale a dark, steep calvary. My hand was confident, and I was ashamed to stumble at times against a rock or root, or to lose my footing. My ravisher was carrying me off. "He's going to think I'm clumsy." However, he thoughtfully and patiently helped me, and the silence he enjoined upon me, the secrecy with which he surrounded the evening, our first night, made me for a moment believe in his love for me. The house smelled neither better nor worse than the others in the Barrio Chino, but the horrible odor of this one will always remain for me the very odor not only of love, but of tenderness and confidence. After making love, the animal odor of my lover lingers in my nostrils a long time. Probably some particles remain clinging to the hairs which line the interior, and it is a bit of his body that I encounter and recreate in me when I sniff. When my sense of smell remembers Stilitano's odor, the odor of his armpits, of his mouth, though it may suddenly come upon them with a disquieting veracity, I believe them capable of inspiring me with the wildest rashness. Sometimes at night I meet a youngster and go with him to his room. At the foot of the stairs, for my trade lives in shady hotels, he takes me by the hand. He guides me as skillfully as did Stilitano. "Watch out." He mumbled these words,
which were too sweet for me. Because of the position of our arms, I was pressed against his body. For a moment I felt the movement of his mobile buttocks. Out of respect, I moved a little to the side. We mounted, narrowly limited by a fragile wall which must have contained the sleep of the whores, thieves, pimps, and beggars of the hotel. I was a child being carefully led by his father. Today I am a father led to love by his child. At the fourth landing, I entered his grubby little room. My whole respiratory rhythm was upset. I was in the throes of love. In the Pariello bars, Stilitano introduced me to his cronies. There were so many mariconas among the people of the Barrio Chino that no one seemed to notice that I liked men. Together, he and I pulled off a few easy jobs which provided us with what we needed. I lived with him, I slept in his bed, but this big fellow was so exquisitely modest that never did I see him entirely. Had I obtained what I so keenly wanted from him, Stilitano would have remained in my eyes the firm and charming master, though neither his strength nor his charm would have gratified my desire for all the manly types. The soldier, the sailor, the adventurer, the thief, the criminal. By remaining inaccessible, he became the epitome of those whom I have named and who stagger me. I was therefore chaste. At times he was so cruel as to require that I button the waistband of his trousers, and my hand would tremble. He pretended not to see anything and was amused. I shall speak later of the character of my hands and of the meaning of this trembling. It is not without reason that in India sacred or disgusting persons and objects are said to be untouchable. Unable to see it, I invented the biggest and loveliest prick in the world. I endowed it with qualities, heavy, strong, and nervous, sober, with a tendency toward pride and yet serene. Beneath my fingers I felt, sculpted in oak, its full veins, its palpitations, its heat, its pinkness, and at times the racing pulsation of the sperm. It occupied less my nights than my days. Behind Stilitano's fly, it was the sacred black stone to which Heliogabalus offered up his imperial wealth. Stilitano was happy to have me at his beck and call, and he introduced me to his friends as his right arm. Now it was his right hand that had been amputated. I would repeat to myself delightedly that I certainly was his right arm. I was the one who took the place of the strongest limb. If he had a girlfriend among the whores of the Calle Carmen, I was unaware of it. He exaggerated his contempt for fairies. We lived together in this way for a few days. One evening, when I was at the Criolla, one of the whores told me to leave. She said that a customs officer had been around looking for me. It must have been the one I had first satisfied and then robbed. I went back to the hotel and told Stilitano about it. He said he would attend to the matter and then left.